So I recently took a trip to Air Studios in London to meet up with Paul and Nino from D Vox. We've got a whole range of videos and interviews around their new album Télégraphe. And in this first video, we talk about how collectively nearly 70 years of studio practice and craft has led to the D Vox project and the album. There's lots of videos to come. The album is out now. Check out the links in the description. Here at Air Studios with Nino and Paul of D Vox, new album. Which should be out when this video comes out, although we're obviously filming a little bit early. Modulars, all this mastering equipment, great studio. The album is fantastic. I'm not going to just try and flatter you too much.
Say that.
Well, I do. I kind of have to say. I wouldn't be here if I thought it was rubbish. But I also wouldn't have just come down as a favour either. It's genuinely a really interesting piece of work.
That's great. Thanks.
That I do, and just wanted to get this off the bat in the first video, really kind of documents where Modular is. I think the kind of newer wave of Modular. It's been a really enjoyable listen. Great for travel. It was great on the way down here today.
Yeah,
driving, everything else, which
that kind of makes sense.
Which suits the concept, which is something we'll get to. But collectively, you've nearly 70 years of kind of studio craft and music practice.
He's really old.
Yes. What led you to Modular ultimately? Because your backgrounds are very wide ranging.
Well, shall I start this one off?
Go ahead.
I think funny enough, I think it's actually some of the stuff that I was involved with quite early on in my music industry career that sort of that took me toward Modular. I wasn't looking for Modular, but I was certainly about 4 years ago. I was looking to get back to a much more sort of, I think, like a lot of people in the sort of post-digital world that we now live in. I was looking to get back to a much more physical sort of relationship with music, and with music creation. I started, back in the early 80s as a tea-boy at Roundhouse Studios, sort of making tea on lots of sessions, then became a sound engineer and a mix engineer in the sort of 80s and early 90s, and was very much part of that sort of UK sort of dance scene at that time, sort of a lot of the music that, we were putting out, and there was a real physical sort of craft to sort of making music back then. I mean, from everything from really just sort of, programming a sampler and chopping up samples in an old Akai sampler, to programming a patch on a synthesizer, to cutting up tape, mastering everything went to tape back in those days. So there's a real physical sort of process there. And if you were doing a 12-inch, for example, or an extended version of a record, everybody was behind a large mixing console, and the mixing console became almost like an instrument. And as a sound engineer, I always saw myself as very much a sort of creative sound engineer, and specialised in sort of mix engineering. And so the mixing console for me, and all those potentiometers, thousands of them, was something that I'd grown up with from a very young age, and it was the first. The first instrument I ever mastered was an SSL 4000 series mixing console, because I felt like I could express myself sonically, with that. So that had been my very much my world for many years, and over the years, like everybody making music and in music production, there came a point where less and less you're engaging with hardware. And at my project studio at home, I sort of increasingly found I was looking over at the sort of rack of kit, MIDI modules and things, and none of it was getting used anymore. And even up until a few years ago, you'd still sort of rack up a Roland JV1080 or something, or or use a little Proteus sort of sound modular interface or something. I'd even stopped doing that, and I'd stopped even using any kind of hardware at all, and I was increasingly working out of the box. And I think that was dictated by many things, and one of them, of course, was budgets and deadlines, very, very quick turnarounds on projects. Yeah. So you just think, oh no, I'll just do it here, and you just work in the box. So increasingly doing this, it sort of felt like making music was the difference between making music and doing my accounts or writing a letter or an email. It was getting blurred, and there was no sort of different space. And I think about 4 or 5 years ago, I just sort of started looking. I thought, well, you know what, I'm just going to find some hardware, and maybe I'll incorporate it in my music production, or maybe I'll just use it just to kind of give myself some kind of therapy. Yeah. So I started looking at things then, and that's sort of how it sort of, how I sort of discovered the reality of what Modular is, because I think for most people, I think this is probably true, when you first look at Modular a few years ago, certainly when there wasn't much more beyond Dover, which is fantastic, but it for those of us making sort of, music that had to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a sort of real narrative and a structure, the idea of a 2 or 3 or a 1 or 2 single oscillator voice kind of modular with a bit of subtractive synthesis going on and an envelope generator and a VCA, I kind of thought, okay, I wasn't sure I was getting it, didn't quite understand it. And of course that, once you start getting into it and, what's happened, of course, since then, as you start to form a very different opinion about what modular is. But that's how, it was looking for a sort of more physical haptic, can I use that word?
Yeah.
Sort of relationship where you get a bit of feedback. When you turn a knob, something happens.
Yeah.
Looking for that. I think that's what took me there.
And I think you see that with a lot of producers, composers that have worked with hardware and gone in the box. I know some great producers that were all hardware and then all completely in the box, 5-10 years, that have then started learning an instrument. They've maybe not gone modular and electronic, but they've just gone, you know what, I just like sitting with a piano or a guitar. And again, it's just that tactile
I think it's the same thing.
Yeah. It's irrelevant that some of these modules are effectively a computer behind a panel.
Yeah.
It totally it doesn't matter.
No.
Because the interface isn't the mouse and the keyboard.
It's the interface. It's the fact that, that human, what you end up creating is something that has a human presence.
Yeah.
And I that does get lost when you're just shifting numbers around with a mouse.
Yeah.
And that, that fuzzy sort of slightly, unprecise sort of way of creating things is sort of what it is to be human. And when that's missing, I don't know what you're left with. It doesn't. I don't know if it emotionally it really touches you. And increasingly that just goes eventually. Or seem to have gone.
Well, I think that human relationship between hardware and us as performers and composers, when laptops could do everything, it was if at that point everybody got bored with them, and watching somebody behind a laptop for 2 hours isn't the most exciting thing in the world. But there's that, as Paul was saying, with regards to that sort of that human relationship. Things that are physical, they have faults, they have limitations, and in that respect, it's a bit like, all your best friends have all got, nobody's perfect, and the fact that the hardware isn't perfect, it creates that character and that relationship that you can build with the hardware. And I think and in terms of that journey that we've both been on, kind of going towards completely working the box, and then suddenly kind of feeling the need to get that sort of tactile central relationship almost with hardware back again, is quite similar. I mean, my background's father was a musician, guitarist for 50 years and worked all around the world, and so I kind of brought up in a musical family. Electronic music was something that I was kind of exposed to at a very young age, and that's always been there. And then through studying piano and doing A-level music and music composition at university, it meant that I kind of had that background of the sort of interest in the tech and the synthesis and so on, but also kind of that sort of more music theory background, but that sort of that appreciation of melody and structure and form and tonality that I think really helps you to make more sense and possibly not necessarily get more, but be able to approach these instruments in a way that's right. I know what I'm trying to do with this, and it doesn't just become about the tech. It's about what we're trying to do with it. The modules in themselves aren't just an end in themselves. They're just a tool that we use to kind of express ourselves in a way that we always have done. And I think that musically we're pretty close in terms of our tastes and what we like to listen to, and in terms of working together as a duo, it has to be there. Otherwise, you're constantly fighting. Well, it wouldn't happen, I suppose. Really, So that's always come very naturally.
I think you've got terrible taste in music.
well, yeah. It's usually,
Two wrongs make a right.
I just feel like I need to be there to sort of keep it on the straight and narrow.
There's two things you spoke. The musical side of it, and anytime music theory comes up in kind of dance music, electronic music circles, modular circles, I tend to get hounded for, once you know theory, it's just paint by numbers, and I absolutely hate it. I hate the idea that because you've got some sense of how this stuff has been constructed, that you just paint by numbers. And I think the musical background speaks to the kind of emotive elements of the album, very much so. And then something you said, Paul, early on about the mixing desk being your first instrument. It wasn't, I grew up playing guitar, it was the mixing desk. Speaks to the kind of the depth and sense of space. in the album as well. It's got this beautiful, it's stereo audio, but this 3D thing, EQ affects the idea of depth as well as width.
Yeah. I think the sonic aspect to what we create is really interesting. I mean, I think we'll probably talk about that maybe a bit later, but that then feeds into the format that we choose to work in, which obviously modular, but also what we how we master, how we record. All of those things are really critical to me because I've grown up and understanding how significant those sort of things are, and anybody that works in music production knows the importance of detail. I remember, one of the first sessions I did, I think it was I was assisting on a session when I was about 15 or 16.
So at this point you'd made tea good enough to be allowed near the gear.
Yeah, no, it was literally my first album. I think it was in my summer holidays. I was only about 15, and I was making tea on a girls' school album, and I think Motorhead were floating around, and Jim Lee and Noddy Holder from Slade were the producers, and I was still at school at this point, and there was. I remember the engineer after the first sort of few days in the studio, the engineer, legendary Trevor Halsey, fantastic. He was an amazing engineer. And he sort of sat me down outside the studio and he said, so what do you think? Knowing full well that I'd never been in the studio or anywhere near that kind of world. What do you think about it? Or, what are your impressions? And I said, well, can't believe all these, you got all these buttons and knobs and you spend a lot of time playing with this stuff and I'm not sure I can really hear the difference. He said, well, what it is all of those little things. He says, yes, when you're sort of working on them independently, you don't necessarily hear the difference, but the cumulative effect of all of those little tiny details is what gives you something that sounds like a finished record. And I think that, along with something a guy called Steve Lipson once said to me, is one of the most important lessons I ever learned about music production. And it is that spending that time crafting something, chipping away at something, and just sculpting it sonically. Not necessarily musically, and
maximising what you've got as well, which again is what modular, because you don't get endless permutations. You've got to maximise, and it forces you sometimes.
Well, limitations.
The limitations, absolutely. And even, both of us as teach at the University of West London, and sometimes I often tell my students, what's the best plugin for this or what's the best microphone for that? And you say, well, it depends what you're trying to achieve with it. That's the key thing. And sometimes, especially with electronic music production, sometimes it's not about having 1,000 plugins and instruments and presets. It's just choose one plugin and stick with it for a year.
Just learn it really well.
And learn it really well.
Yeah, learn it really well and also learn. I think understanding that conceptually what is it you're trying to achieve. I think understanding what it is to be creative practitioner is probably more important than anything. Training your ears is critical. You should be able to work with anything. The other great lesson I had, again, around that sort of time, I was assisting on a Frankie Goes to Hollywood session where Steve Lipson was the engineer. They were at Roundhouse Studios rather than SAM for this particular session. And I'd only been sort of working in studios for a few weeks or months, I can't remember. And I asked Steve Lipson something about the mixing console. Again, I was trying to figure it out and what was going on with all these knobs. And I remember he just said, it's a button. They're just buttons that just need pushing. They're just a means to an end. You want to get there, I find the button that gets you there. Yeah. And I think that's a critical lesson. Again, that was a vital lesson for me. It almost doesn't. The equipment almost doesn't matter. What matters is the concept. Having some sort of idea in your head of what something should sound like or what it is that you're trying to make something sound like. These are things, and then you work towards it. It almost doesn't matter how you get there or what you use, it almost doesn't matter.
Or what rules you supposedly break in that process.
I think the problem with working just straight out of the box is wonderful for sort of creating a really specific brief. So you've been asked to create something that sounds like that. It's great because that is, for me, painting by numbers a lot of the time. You're just kind of putting stuff around. I know there are some, people do some wonderful things with, DSP but a lot of the time it is painting by numbers, and you're just kind of moving those numbers around so you get.
And you can feel yourself going through the motions as well.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. And
either templates you use or certain plugins you put on in certain orders, and
especially if you're working to deadlines and you're working quickly. So a lot of that sort of pure artistic endeavour gets lost. Yeah. And I think previously, when there was still an element of hardware, even not too long ago, up until a few years ago, when there's still an element of hardware involved, it did sort of slow things down. It did force you to get out of the seat, plug something in. you know, and maybe turn a knob, and there's still a bit.
But you're really thinking about it as you go do it. If you know, if there's a compressor behind the camera at that side of the room, we're working, we want to go turn it on, it forces you to think.
Yeah.
Just that 2 meters back and forth to the piece of equipment, or turning around, or standing up. I think it really does make you realise what your intentions are.
Yeah.
If you weren't already thinking about them going into the project.
It's like Brian Eno's oblique strategies. He says, like, get up, go walk around the block and come back, or do something backwards, or just that sort of breaking that thought process. Very easy to get into that rut, and do something that gets you out of that is always important to do. I think, and again, sort of Modular kind of affords that a lot more.
I mean, I think there's also there. You know, I mean, I was really missing. I remember distinctly feeling, you know, I used to really enjoy just sort of chopping samples up. I'd have a day of sampling records, you know, where I'd part of my production process used to be that I'd have this day once a month where I'd go in the studio with no other objective other than to sample.
I still do that now.
Yeah,
I call it sample fodder. It's like hip-hop DJs crate digging, just all this modular stuff I've been working on, and pull it off. And I love it. I don't see it as you said, as a creative endeavour. It's Sunday afternoon, feet up, maybe the family are out, just going to pull little percussion samples out and try and repurpose it.
Stuff like that, you know, and but
it's almost audio admin, isn't it, to a point? It's
but I mean, I mean, it's when you get into the editing though, and I then sort of, you know, create, you know, using old Akai samplers and stuff, then creating programs and putting a bit of modulation on there and using the effects cards and stuff. I mean, I used to love all that, and there wasn't necessarily a sort of end sort of game. It was just part of a bigger process, and then I'd come back to some of that content later on as part of a production, maybe later on. But that, you know, once that all went, you know, I didn't even notice that sort of part of the process all disappear. Just suddenly realised one day that wasn't there, and that's why I started looking for things. When the penny dropped as to what was possible with what what we call new modular, sort of essentially the evolution of the Eurorack format. I think for most of us, it was kind of okay. So, wow, you can do so much. I mean, you can be so expressive in so many different ways with this format. And initially, there was no plan in my head anyway, I think, about how... we sort of got into about a similar time. I seem to remember we were having a conversation. We were both curious, weren't we? And about it. And
Modular curious.
Modular curious. It was as a whole separate video maybe there. And that was interesting. I mean, it was great that there was somebody else sort of going on the same journey at the same time. So we were able to.
I had a couple of friends around the same time getting into it, feeding off it. Have you seen this filter? Have you seen what this can do? And this sounds like this thing I've been doing, but I can touch it and I can do this. I remember that curiosity and that excitement.
I think I was getting to the point where I was either going to buy a Nord Lead 4, or I was going to start a Eurorack system. And then for a few months, I said,
don't get the Nord.
I do love the Nord stuff, but yes, it kind of is stuff.
I remember that conversation.
So to nicely lead into, and we've got all these separate videos, all these topics we want to talk about. The second video I want to talk about is performance. From the idea of performance, which is how I got to know you both, seeing you play at various events, to this concept album. But what, from being...
I love that you call it a concept album. That's great. It is a concept album.
It is.
No, it really is. It's great.
It didn't start off like that. It kind of... But we'll talk about that later.
That's the next video. But from this modular curiosity to the performance bit, kind of to bookend up to this next video, this kind of next topic we want to talk about. How long was that process? Was it exciting? Was it frustrating?
Pretty quick.
It was quick.
It was really quick, and it I hadn't really when we were getting into it. I don't think either of us had really thought about performance at all. It certainly wasn't on my agenda.
No,
and but almost immediately you suddenly thought, I've got to play this out somehow. I've got to sort of perform this, because because it's also transient. You know, stuff happens. You know what it's like. Stuff seems to happen. It goes by very quickly. And you're like, wow, what just happened? And then you're off down another rabbit hole, and you're constantly thinking, I need to capture this. I need to.
It's that same feeling as the 13-year-old that can just play his first 3-chord pop song. You want to get out and do it, and you've got that kind of.
But I had the spontaneity and that naivety is really important, and it's quite easy to kind of almost especially with sort of computer-based music production, so easy to engineer all of that out, and Modular and even years and years later, you still
being
get
a
that.
studio person, I sort of, I wasn't at all thinking performance with it. It was not remotely on the agenda. And I've heard a lot of people say this as well. I think it was Phil Billsby. I think it was being interviewed, and he said, I think he said a similar thing. It just says, let's go perform, let's go play. It's great. So it was quite quick, and we had the first thing that I have this other thing called Lars Deception, which is a much more abstract kind of creative endeavour that I do, and I had this idea for this thing called Cold Waves, and it was triggered by a conversation that I'd had with Nino one afternoon about listening to number stations back in the 80s, which used to spook the hell out of me when I was a kid. And my dad bought
secret transmissions, shortwave radio transmissions of MI5 or Mossad communicating with agents in the field, just strings of numbers being read out.
Yeah. So I had this. I wanted to make I wanted to somehow. I got
conceptual
into my head.
Piece,
And
really.
the concept for that project, for the Cold Waves project, was there's the Conet project, sort of recordings that they made in the 80s or 90s of all of these 80s sort of number station broadcasts, and we wanted to transcode that into music. That was the idea, and create that somehow evoked the terror and horror of growing up as a kid during the Cold War. And
with the visual elements as well.
Yeah, we hooked up with a guy called Larry Whelan, who essentially we did it using 2 modulars and a max patch that sort of was like an Enigma device, and then we literally input. We got transcriptions of these number station broadcasts and dumped them into this max patch, which then spurted out sort of music, and we could select the key and the sort of mode that we worked in, and we put together all these crazy images. And we had
Stasi undercover secret police photos from the Czech Republic and
we got
East Germany
to perform it at Music Tech Fest in
2016,
Funkhouse, which was in that big hall, which was a perfect location, which some of those number stations probably would have been broadcast from. And it was pretty scary stuff. And we had Shostakovich in the Phonogene getting mangled and stuff, and it was great.
That's the first thing we ever did.
And it was on the back of that. But we got to the end of that, and everybody came up. People that commented on the performance afterwards, nobody was interested in the concept, which was really gutting. And it was like, can I have a look at your modular? And everyone just wanted to look at
coming out
live.
of the darkness, peering over the systems.
So we thought, you know what, maybe we'll ditch the laptop and and let's just do that. So that's kind of how that started.
So from there to when was the first D Vox performance after that? Was that the thing that made you realise that there's a project in this for you both?
Driving back from Berlin, and we started talking about it.
Yes, you're right, actually.
So
we drove to Berlin. And we drove, you're right. Even in the car coming back, we thought, let's put something together. And I think both of us immediately thought, there's an opportunity here to just make the kind of music we want to make for the sake of it. And
not for commercial reasons.
No, and that's been massively liberating. It's like therapy. So that was the plan, and I think we got back and we started pitching to a few places. And I can't actually remember the first.
That was our first gig. I was just thinking that.
What was it?
We played Super Booth in 2017.
I'm not entirely sure what the first one was.
Okay.
God, that's terrible.
So I don't think it was Super Booth.
No, I'm sure we played before that.
And
for anyone wanting to perform a modular, that would be quite a hell of an entrance. First gig was just Super Booth, the biggest thing for modern modular.
That was sort of, I think there was a couple before that, and there was more than that. I think I can't remember. We did some live video stuff as well. We did some content for some students. So we might have done something. We did some stuff at LCM, at the London College of Music. But I mean, they were,
preparation, really, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that we spent a lot of time. I don't think we thought it through too much, but we sort of worked out a basic strategy for performing together. And I think we were quite safe initially. We were quite conservative in what we tried. I think there was a sort of, you don't want to cock it up. So we weren't too adventurous with those initial sort of performances. So they're looking back at them now. There's some video footage out there of them. They're a little bit conservative, I think. And
a warm-up period almost. It sounds like there's this kind of blurry-ish phase from the
we're
cold
still
wave
learning the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
to D Vox, yeah.
You know, we're still learning.
And also in terms of the
Modular.
musicality for what we were doing then compared to now, it just seems like miles away. Even from one gig to another, it suddenly seems to go leap forward a step every single time.
In fact, I say the first sort of true D Vox gig in terms of sort of that where there was a sound. I think that we sort of thought that sounds like, well, that's us, isn't it? That's it. You know, it was Superbooth 2017. I think we did that, and it felt brilliant at the time. It just really.
Well, having heard that leads us on to the next video that we'll cut to. That is D Vox to me. That was when I first encountered the music, and it has, as you say, things progress, but that's where this theme of kind of D Vox comes into its own. That style.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you could feel it was good feedback, and people, you could just tell people were getting it, and it felt great, and we were buzzing really when we left that, just because it just musically was very interesting, and that was also the trigger for thinking about the possibility of recording an album, and getting stuff recorded. So you start thinking, well, hang on, we need to document this.